Hello and welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast, and we're with one of the Lib Dem's newest councillors, and we are going to talk about just how Ryan Preece got over the line in an area with no Lib Dems, who 5 years ago pretty much didn't have a Lib Dem in the ballot in this seat. It's an absolutely brilliant story and a brilliant learning for all of us on perseverance and how you keep going and how you can win. Welcome to the Lib Dem Podcast. Hello, welcome. Yes, we are back with the Lib Dem Podcast, and I'm really, really excited. And first of all, I should say a huge congratulations to our guest, Councillor Ryan Preece. Hello, Ryan. How are you doing?
Hi, John. I'm fantastic. It still doesn't feel quite real.
So we are going to talk about where your whole journey into standing in a seat in 2018, which had no Lib Dems in 2018, from you going to win it in a ward where, if you were to think about where Lib Dems should stand anywhere in the country, this probably wouldn't be high on the mark because of all the various things you're going to have to deal with. It's a brilliant, brilliant story that you're going to tell us. So first of all, we'll just say, obviously, congratulations. Last Thursday, Ryan was one of 3 gains the Lib Dems made, so congratulations to all the other Lib Dems as well. And you are now a councillor in Dudley. So I've got to ask, how has the first week been?
It's mostly been full of congratulations. So actually, we've got another by-election in a fortnight in Dudley. So all of the kind of inductions that should have been this week, they're leaving until the end of the month, which I'm glad about, actually. So it's not quite been as heavy as I was expecting. So that's good. But I assume that's all going to change. Give it 10 days.
And when we talk to the audience about where your journey through to get to the win, we should just point out, let's just recap your win, shall we, Ryan? So on Thursday last week, as we're recording, you won with 52.2% of the vote, squashed Labour down to only 30%, Conservatives disappeared to 14%, Greens and the trade unionists were down under 5%. And it was a huge gain, quite unusual the fact we gained from Labour. Lib Dems have been really successful at taking off the Tories, but you had an incredible win. So I suppose going into the election, how confident were you of actually winning?
We were confident that there was going to be a recount, which there ended up not being. But no one took it for granted, and I'm certain that was the other side for Labour as well, that for anything that we had an advantage, Labour had an equivalent advantage in another area. So it really was 50-50. We fought who was going to take it. And I felt like that right up until polling day as well. No one told me what was about to happen.
So let's go right the way back then. Let's go. So when did you, so there was no Lib Dem in 2018 at all. So when did you start eyeing up this seat, and why this seat in particular?
Well, I think I was a paper candidate somewhere like the complete opposite side of the borough in 2018 in Castle and Priory ward, which is right in Dudley town centre. And we didn't do anything, and it felt wrong to me to not do anything, but I didn't know the ward. I just got my signatures. And so, and the only reason I was a paper candidate there was because we had one of those dreaded electoral packs with the Greens, which meant my ward ended up having a Green candidate instead of a Lib Dem candidate. And so I think the following year, I always knew I wanted to stand in the ward I know, where I grew up, and that's what Cradley Woolscote is. I grew up in Cradley. I live in Woolscote. I knew all of it already, and so there was no learning, how to get around and directions and stuff. It's home, and I think I just caught the bug. So obviously I've got family and friends in the ward, and they're asking why they hadn't seen leaflets, and I had to explain to them that we're the Liberal Democrats in Dudley. We just don't do that anymore. The party infrastructure just wasn't there.
It's probably worth pointing out that there hasn't been when was the last time a Lib Dem was actually on Dudley Council? It was a long time ago.
It was, yeah. So we lost our last 1 or 2, I can't remember, to defections in 2010. And it's been 2007 was the last time we made a gain.
Yeah, so it's been not quite an entire black hole, But if you think about how far the world has moved on politically since that time, it is an age.
Yeah. It's an entire generation of activists that have moved on. So there's no any kind of local base that's in the party now has been built around this ward. That even at the heyday of the Liberal Democrats in Dudley, we were once the second largest party in the borough. If you go back to the early 2000s, even then, Cradley and Woodescope was not on anybody's radar for the birth of liberalism in Dudley. It's just not. It was never a realistic prospect.
And just so people won't know, obviously, the ward as intimately as you do. So is it traditionally always been a Labour, Tory kind of marginal ward, or has it been fairly solidly Labour?
It's always been Labour. Cradley has some. The ward's relatively new. It only came into existence in 2004, and was split prior to that. So Cradley's got some Liberal tradition, but you're talking early 70s. But a long time ago when it was there, but there will still be the golden oldies who remember the good old days when the Liberals were here. Woodescote has always been Labour, so for the vast majority of its existence, it's been a Labour safe seat. 50-60% of the vote in most elections. The exception to that being 2021 when the Conservatives took it for the first and I'm going to make sure last time.
And we'll get to that. So listeners, as you'll know, this is going to, like I said, this ward, for people who are learning to campaign, is almost a perfect example of how you can go from virtually nothing, no infrastructure, to an incredible victory. So you decided you had some local knowledge, you decided this is where I want to go. And so you fought in 2019. Was that as a paper candidate, or did you put a little bit of effort into it?
It was a paper candidate with a Facebook page. So it was nothing really. That 4% is our base vote plus some family friends.
Yeah. So you got 128 votes in 2019. Labour won that one with 1,180 votes. And had a 330-odd majority over the Tories, who had a fairly respectable 849 votes. And then we also had UKIP, you had the Black Country Party, all beating you as well. So you were last on that in that result. And it's really important at that point for the Dudley Council was also a really marginal borough as well. So at that point, both Labour and the Conservatives had 36 councillors each. So again, all the things we think about is what's going to make an election difficult to be a Lib Dem. You are behind, you are starting from scratch, you are in a hyper-competitive kind of borough. So the ability for you to be squeezed by the opposition was there. So after 2019, why did you think, right, well, I'm going to take this on. I'm going to, I think there's a way for me to get there. What was your thinking?
It was pure stubbornness. Like, I'd love to tell you that there was like some grand master plan for how we could take it, but I was entirely stubborn that the only ward I was willing to stand in was the one that I called home. And I remember having conversations with my local party. There's still a few ex-councillors involved in the local party. And there was this soft push for me to stand in one of their old seats because they're a bit more affluent. It's a bit more what you would expect from a Lib Dem seat. All the ones we had were on the border of Worcestershire. There's still people who remember us from those days, and they're Tory facing, not Labour facing. And there was a belief that the bubble would burst for the Tories then, and obviously we now know that's the truth. That that is what happened. And I won't lie, they're also a lot flatter, and that's the one thing that was actually convincing. My ward is full of hills, but no, it was stubbornness entirely.
So did you start thinking at this point? Obviously, we're going to end up getting into COVID within a year and a bit of that. But what did you start to do to make was part of that stubbornness? Did you start knocking on doors? Was it slightly more regular leaflets? How did you then start getting active?
So I think we left it a bit late in the 2021? I got 10%.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. 11. Let's round up to 11. You got 10.83.
So that was a leaflet only campaign. I was still at university at the time, and I was at university in London. So as much as I lived and it was my home, I wasn't there at home full time. So I came back for the locals, and we were putting out leaflets. But I didn't really know how to campaign. I'd never really done any canvassing, really, and so we just put out free leaflets. I'm fairly sure we only did them in Cradley as well, because it was the area it's where my mom lives, and it's the area I knew better of the two at the time.
And you alluded to it earlier. So in 2021, we did see lots of areas of the country, including mine. We did see a bump in the Tory vote, that whether it's a vaccine boost they got in their vote, but the Tories actually took that ward. Strangely enough, the Labour vote stayed fairly consistent at 38%, but the Tories got a huge bump and won that seat by 163. So you've talked about your stubbornness. Your vote went up. Your vote went up, like say, to just shy of 11%. You came third. But after that, did you think, whoa, this is going to be too big a mountain to climb? What did you think when the Tories took that seat? Because that must have been annoying.
It was irritating. And I think what I've always liked about the ward is despite it being like the one bit of activity for the party, we've still always had fairly friendly elections with Labour and the Conservatives, but Labour like the main opponents. So there was a part who was like, I was kind of sad to see that Labour councillor lose, because she'd been there for such a huge part. For the vast majority of my life, she'd been my councillor. Didn't agree with her on very much, but she was a nice person. So that was tough to watch, as it, at a personal level it was.
Did you get any pressure? Did you get any pressure because obviously the Tory majority of 163 and you got 346? Now there are lots of people who don't understand how elections work that will say, oh well, Ryan, you've cost Labour that seat and surely it's about getting rid of the Tories. Did you receive any of that nonsense?
Not from within the ward.
Yeah.
So outside the wider Labour Party, there was a little bit of it. Twitter talked about it a little bit. But not from anyone that mattered. And also, it wouldn't be true if you look at the results from the rest of the borough. The Tories got much larger swings in that election in pretty much every single ward. And what we know from the last three elections, three elections since then, is we're much better at taking Tory votes as it is. So I would suggest if it wasn't for us getting that much, the Tories would have had a much more substantial majority at that election.
Exactly, and I do think people who talk about that think that voters are just easy blocks that you just shift, or why it's Labour, they just don't understand the dynamics of how political voting works. And actually, the Labour vote was up that year compared to the previous one. The Tories just got a huge bump, either from a slightly increased turnout, or or the fact that UKIP didn't stand. That was another one. So UKIP had taken 440 odd votes the year before and then didn't stand that particular. And the Tories took a number of seats in Dudley and took control of the council that year. And then coming out of that, you thought, right, you're still going. You've done a little bit of paper campaign. Now 2022, I would say, was probably a big turning point looking at the data, because in that election, you came second and you just pipped the Tories into second by 10 votes. Now, Labour won that vote again with a majority of 238 over you. But how important was coming second?
It was incredible. And when we were going in, actually, we struggled because we weren't sure who our opponents were. The Tories had just won, but were going up against the Labour councillor. 2022, the mood was shifting away from the Conservatives, but Johnson was still there. And particularly in Dudley, which gets grouped into Redwall quite a lot, but it's not. It's a more traditionally Conservative area. It was really hard to get the messaging right on who our opponent was, and we made it the Conservatives. Yeah. Despite it being a Labour-facing seat. And it obviously worked for us. We got a huge swing against them. But beating them into third place meant that we could squeeze them in. It meant that we presented ourselves as the real challengers to Labour in Cravey and Woolscote. And even to do so, you know, it may have only been 10 votes, but it just showed how much momentum was behind us. To get us over the line.
Because that was a huge lift. So you nearly trebled your vote in the space of a year. And actually, it became another thing which Lib Dems often can sometimes have palpitations about. It became a three-way split between, I mean, roughly. So Labour got just under 39% of the vote. You got 31. The Tories got 30. So it couldn't really be any closer.
And I should say, actually, we went into that election thinking we had a chance of winning that one. And I bumped into the Labour councillor who ended up winning on polling day. And I've never seen him look so glum. Like, he was adamant that he'd lost because of the momentum that we had in part of the ward.
So what did you do to get that momentum? I'm sure our listeners will be interested.
It would, and you know, I think we followed the ALDC playbook pretty much to a T. We did surveys through the year that we reported back on within the space of a fortnight. Any issues, very hyper-local street letters off the back of surveys. We started doing segmented focus leaflets, so rather than one, there's 5,500 houses in the ward and 3 very distinct communities within the ward. So it was important that we started talking about it was hyper-local issues within those focus leaflets. And that also presents the idea that the issues better than anybody else as well, when you can talk about it with such detail.
And that's something that sometimes gets lost with campaigning, is how much campaigning helps you be a better councillor stroke politician. Is actually, it's not a zero-sum. So, you're just a campaigner, you're just knocking on doors. Well, actually, by knocking on doors, you get the issues more than any other way you could possibly get, because people that return surveys will generally be people that are more likely to like you than not. Well, actually knocking on the doors, you'll get the disgruntled Tories, the disgruntled Labours, the people that have never voted in their life, and you find out the real nuts and bolts of what's happening in your ward.
Yeah, it was essential for us, because essentially, if there's no Lib Dems in the borough, and I'd suggest this is the same way for places with quite smaller groups as well. I'm a Lib Dem by membership, but in my ward, I'm a yellow independent. It's because that's how we had to market it. No one in my ward voted Lib Dem in any of the elections past that 4%. It's all been about me and the team fixing local issues, and that's important to reflect in the messaging as well. We're very proud that we are Liberal Democrats. We don't hide the fact. But they're not voting for us for that. They're voting for us because we fixed their potholes and cleaned up their park. And
at some point, I mean, that raises an interesting debate that we've had on the podcast, like how you go sometimes, because ultimately it's the same in most places. There'll be people that vote for myself, people that vote for you, who will never be card carrying liberals, but actually they vote for you because of your efforts on the ground, and we just work it better than the other parties. But how then, at some point, whether me and you go off, move house, whatever happens, you need to have some sort of legacy there. And I suppose that comes from time, actually, as much as anything, that you get people in my ward, which has now been Lib Dem for 40 years, who intrinsically, when they think of Lib Dems, and it's quite usual because my ward's Cadley and yours is Cradley, which makes it a little bit just getting things awkward, is the fact that they now associate good local politics with being Lib Dem.
Yeah, and that's the next challenge for us, I think, is that so much of the branding has been about me, the candidate, who happens to be a Lib Dem. How do we get people to start voting for the Lib Dem team? And it's going to be more of the same, but it's just the team that's doing it rather than Ryan that's doing it.
Yeah,
I would suggest is how we're going to do it.
And the next stage, I suppose, when you go to the level up above where obviously we are in terms of target parliamentary seats, and I often have this conversation with Lib Dems in smaller groups that, it's okay to win on local issues. There's nothing wrong with that. They know that, Lib Dems, in all due respect, are probably not going to take the Dudley parliamentary seat. So But, we should always stand a candidate. We should always give people the option to vote Lib Dem. But actually, when Lisa and Tom come on and talk about the national politics, they have to convert people from the locally, love the Lib Dems locally, to voting for us on a national issue, trusting us not just with their potholes, but with their budgets, their policing, their military budgets, and all the rest of it. But it's okay for you just to concentrate on those local issues when you're in your position.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So the next one is 2023, and this must have been painful, disappointing. So for all those who haven't followed Ryan's journey, so you missed out by 21 votes. So in 2023, added complication, the Greens turned up. Now, whether the Greens, they only got 89 votes, but it's interesting to wonder where those votes came from. So the Greens turn up, you missed by 21 votes, and we should just be aware for all those for all the listeners that the person that beat you, the Labour candidate that beat you on that day, very sadly died the following week. So we will talk a little bit about how you deal with that in terms of messaging, in how you genuinely and properly be sympathetic to the point that is obviously, whatever party politics is going on, someone losing their life is more important. But how did you 2023 must have been an absolute gut punch for you in terms of missing out by just 21 votes.
It was the emotions are really kind of hard to describe, because we didn't go in with like the expectation that we would win. And the national picture finally was shifting against the Conservatives. So we knew Labour were riding high in the polls, but it just wasn't coming through on the ground. There was no excitement for Labour at all, really. And so we didn't know what was going to happen. And I'm happy to admit, polling day, I thought we'd won. All of our canvass data suggested that we were going to win with a decent majority. And obviously we didn't. And there's a lot of debate about how that ended up not happening. And in reality, I think what it for Labour was they had a much better get out the vote operation on the day. I think we lost that election on the final day of the campaign. And that was tough to deal with. But it was, I think we lost on the early Friday morning. I think we decided by the Saturday, dust ourselves off. Let's go again next year.
That's hard to do. So I mean, I was in a similar. I lost by 52 in my first election, and it's difficult to tell people when you're not a candidate yourself how emotionally and physically knackering that can be, and quite in a weird way similar to you. I had a by-election 6 months later, and then I was first elected in 2010. But to pick yourself up, I mean, there's two ways you can go. Either you can really take it badly, say, sod the lot of you, this isn't going to happen, or you've got to be a little bit bloody minded, and perhaps me and you both have this a little bit in ourselves. I think, right, no, we're gonna win this. We're gonna do this. But obviously, you had the added complication of, unfortunately, councillor Body's death. So how? I mean, it's a really difficult thing. How did you then think, okay, we knew there was a by-election going to happen at some point. How did you get that balance right with being respectful, politics must continue?
The dealing with the respectful bit, I think, was difficult from the outside looking in, but from my own perspective, there was never, ever any dislike for him. We spoke plenty over the years. He was the only one I've fought twice. He was the guy I was a paper candidate against back in 2019, and so I was genuinely upset. Like the Labour candidate who lost in 2021, he'd been there for a very, very long time, and so it did upset me. And so I think the difficult bit was how soon it was after the result of the last election in terms of messaging. I mean, And so we had lots of chats with lots of different people and decided that we still had to put out our thank you leaflet with, to tell people about the result. But we changed it substantially from what we were planning to put in it. So we stripped out all the politics. It was one slide, the result, a little bit of, community news, but the bulk of it was about Richard's sad passing and a link to the fundraiser he'd launched not long before he passed. And we thought that was the right thing to do. I still think that was the right thing to do. We got a bit of stick for it, which I suppose isn't surprising because
from who? From Labour?
From the press, I think. I think the press picked up on it first, and then Labour, used that as a platform to criticise us. I don't think Labour started that.
Yeah.
It's just not like them to do. But I think once the press had put it out there, it was decided that. And in reality, it became a bit like our own localised tuition fees issue, in that the people who are angry,
we're probably not going to vote for you anyway.
Exactly. Yeah, 100% that. So it was used to be angry with me. But the vast majority of people either didn't remember getting a leaflet or thought it was entirely respectful and the right tone. And like I say, I still think it was the right thing to do because it was sincere, what we put in there.
So there was quite a delay in terms, because sometimes by-elections can happen very quickly within 6 weeks, etc. So so the election was eventually called. Did you go? I'm trying to think how. So from a campaigning point of view, again, as sad as deaths are, and it was the same we've had obviously when Stephen Amos died and things like that. There was a lot of debate about whether tragedies do happen, but ultimately people have the right to still be represented and be represented properly. And I suppose at that point, once the election's called, you've got to crack on and try and win it because you believe you are the best candidate to represent those people. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think both myself and Richard, who was the councillor who passed away, had quite a strong personal vote in the ward. So there was some smatterings of pressure that, as there is with every by-election, the party that won last time to just get in, but that just wouldn't have worked in this ward because so much of the votes go to people, not parties. And I think actually Labour did the right thing. The Labour group leader gave me a call before the by-election was called and said, this is how it's going to happen. We'll call it, we'll call for it the day after Richard's funeral. We obviously expect you're going to stand. We're going to throw everything at it. We know you're going to throw everything at it.
Okay.
And so all cards are on the table from the beginning.
Yeah, that you know what, we can get sometimes distracted by the Punch and Judy politics that takes place in Westminster, but actually that is the Labour group there have actually been very respectful to you as well in terms of they understand the score, and so it's actually generally quite pleasant to hear that actually that conversation was had, and then it was getting into the election. So, I mean, we talked about resilience and things like that. That you must have thought, because I assume Labour piled everything into that ward.
Yeah, it was, if not in the borough, it was the West Midlands top target. We had Labour councillors and activists from across the country coming up. And shockingly, the Tories piled in too.
Really?
VIP visit from Penny Mordaunt on one day.
Not with a giant sword or anything like that.
And as I joked with one Tory councillor, she'd probably need a weapon to convince some people to vote Conservative in the ward now. So it's a shame she didn't bring it. But all three parties piled in. I think the Conservatives just were never going to undo 2.5 years of squeeze messaging.
Yeah.
And obviously they didn't.
Their vote went down even further. Their vote went, because they got about 19% in the May elections, and that dropped down to 14%, I think, last week.
Yeah. And I think Labour struggled really struggled to know how to campaign, because the campaign they ran just wasn't the right campaign for the ward. It didn't really touch on local issues. It kind of paid lip service to local issues and talked a lot about national stuff. And then their final leaflet of the campaign, I would have written that for them. It was brilliant, because it actually talked about us and it attacked us, and it suddenly cemented that we are this race is between. But best of all, it attacked the coalition, and so maybe that hurts people who've been in the party for a very long time. But I was 13 when the coalition started, and people in the ward would know that, and it just looked silly.
Yeah, and I think there's too often there were some absolutely massive mistakes there, and we've had that from the Tories locally here as well, where as soon as they start talking about you and your campaign, half your job is done because they've moved on to your turf, which is exactly where you want them to be. And too many in Labour, and again, we have it up here as well for those who are Labour, and and we often talk about, me and Hannah Kitchen talk about Labour quite a bit, is the fact that they keep on trying to win battles in the past instead of concentrating on what's going forward. And most people don't give politics that much thought, let alone politics from 10 years ago. And this is what I say to all Lib Dems who are on there, I can't believe we haven't. Someone on Twitter's had a go at me. Twitter is not the real world. Just spend an hour a week knocking on real people's doors, and you'll see that's where people are actually at.
And that's definitely where Labour struggled, because they clearly designed their messaging based off talking to each other, where every single thing that went in our leaflet was based on conversations with people on the doors. Yeah.
Now, obviously, let's talk about the victory. So, we were all quite nervous. I was in ALDC HQ. We had the by-elections coming up this week. We had 3 potential gains, of which we took them all. One of them was yours. And I do remember someone in the office going, I just really hope Ryan gets over the line, So leading up to that final week into the election, what was going through your head during those through the day, polling day? How did it feel?
It was highs and lows within hours of each other. It was polling day, and the day before actually was probably the calmest I'd been throughout the election, which I didn't expect to happen. I think it's more who the kind of person I am, actually. So it's my own doing. But the week before that, I'd put so much weight on myself about getting us over the line. I felt like the responsibility of the party and how much support we'd had over the last couple of years, the way a lot of residents talk about us now is, I felt like I owed it to them to win. And I think that's really what upset me in 2023 when we lost by so little. I put all this pressure on ourselves, and then it got to the eve of poll, and our leaflets turned up late. So what we were meant to be delivering at 8 o'clock, they turned up at 3 o'clock, and I was fine. I was too tired to care. What will be will be. Yeah. And it was the same all through. And actually, above all else, it was actually really fun. It was a really fun. The later half of election was just a really good, fun campaign. We had lots of support come from across the region and the country, actually. And we just enjoyed the time we were campaigning as well, and then won us, which made it even better.
And you obviously had disruptions like parliamentary by-elections happening as well, because obviously we had Somerton and Frome happening, where everyone was saying, get down to Somerset, and you're thinking, no, I've got to win my by-election as well.
I remember there's a WhatsApp group for West Midlands PPCs, and as with all WhatsApp groups, no one's really paying attention what gets posted in them. And so I posted, please come and help me, we're so close, Penny Mordaunt's here, where are you? And then I think about 10 minutes later, Helen Morgan posted saying, please get down to Somerton, it's so close. Rishi Sunak's here, where are you? And it's like, well, I know where they're going now, but...
Yeah, but let's talk about your actual victory. So in raw numbers, so given that in May you'd lost by 21, so last week you won with 1,321 votes, a 550 majority over the Labour. And interestingly, this is the first time the Labour Party vote has dropped significantly as well. Now, the Tory vote dropped even further down to only 300. Again, Tories were north of 1,000 votes, Labour were north of 1,000 votes. What do you attest that level of victory to, other than your brilliant work and bloody mindedness?
It was the hyperlocal focus. We ended up segmenting our election leaflets. So the final week of the campaign was just your standard focus leaflet that said, please don't forget to vote at the end. And we put a different one out in each polling district.
Wow.
Which really cemented, when you compare that to Labour's fly tipping is bad, we'll stop it. You know, it was service to local issues. And then we were saying, look at the street lamp we've fixed. There's this petition on this one road where the speeding is bad. That was what got us over the line. We also had a fantastic endorsement letter from somebody who's very well known in part of the community that helped us crack one polling district. And I think, so listeners know, since 2021, sorry,
so many
elections. It's been a very divided ward, in that Cradley, we'd get about 60 to 70% of the vote in every box, and Woolscope Labour would get about 70 to 80% of the vote, actually. And the Tories kind of quite reasonably, not strong, but, you know, a noticeable amount of Tories in one polling district. And we'd just never been able to crack the Woolscope boxes. We'd canvassed it extra hard. We'd worked it hard in 22 and 23 and still didn't crack it. You know, 2023, it was still about 80% Labour. And it was really, really tough to break through there. But when we did, and we still haven't picked them up. You know, we got 40% to Labour's 50 in those boxes. But the jump from getting 18 votes in 22 in one of those boxes to now 40% of the votes is what got us over the line as well. We're finally a ward-wide party.
And I suppose, again, we like to talk a lot about campaigning in this podcast. Knowing that work, doing those box counts on at the count, so you know where your vote is coming, combined with your canvassing statistics, gives you a better idea than any of the other parties of where that vote will be. So you can target. And, you know, because ultimately, as you've mentioned, we don't have unlimited manpower. We're often scrabbling with other people's attentions, whether that's parliamentary by-elections, summer holidays, stuff happening with kids at home, whatever else. Then actually using your resources well and efficiently is a key part to winning, because there's no point, you know, if there's an area where nobody votes at all, has never voted, then in a run-up to an election, these aren't the people you want to concentrate on.
Not at all. And even more so in areas like mine, where up until this election, I was pretty much the lone canvasser in the ward, because that's just what our manpower is like around here.
Yeah.
And so there's not enough time to speak to everybody.
Yeah.
So we had to speak to people who we knew we could rely on to actually go out and vote, and that started with postal voters, actually, and then it moved on to you know, on the day voters who we could rely on.
So we've had quite a few kind of campaigning tips off you about hyper-localized issues. I take it that was met with direct mail as well. I don't know how much you actually did, but what were your top campaign from going from standing start to mighty 500 odd majority? What would be your campaigning tips for people who listen?
That's a good question. It's easier to win your postal vote first, I think. We won the postal vote in the last 3 elections now, and because you know they're going to go out, you know their turnout is going to be mostly the same. In my area, you know that they're mostly Tories, and so even if you haven't canvassed them, I'd guess they're probably Tories in most areas.
Yeah.
And so you can start doing your squeeze messaging or your switch messaging to all postal voters and just take the chance that they're going to be Tory. And if you win that, everything after that, you know, that's your bonus points, because they've got to eat into your majority on the postals after that. And you can do that with direct mailing and keep them sweet. And we got ALDC's, one of ALDC's grants, or 2 of ALDC's grants, which we used to target postal voters. Yeah. In the 2023 locals, and we did it again with blue letters in the by-election. So target everything, whether that's on demographic or geographic. Every single message should be targeted, but your postal voters especially are good to work on.
Is there any part of campaigning you don't like? And if there is, how do you overcome it if it's an important part of campaigning?
I mean, the only thing coming to mind is I really hate delivering leaflets.
Oh, right. So outrageous thing to say on the Lib Dem podcast.
I know, but I could spend hours and hours and hours canvassing. I love it. If it's not just in my own ward, I've enjoyed when we've gone to help in other people's by-elections, parliamentary by-elections. I love canvassing. But I find delivery just really mind-numbing. And it's like, oh, when's it going to end? And so how I've overcome it is we've just recruited more and more deliverers, and most of them I'm related to, I admit. But I think that's probably the message for anyone as well, that if whatever your weakness is, find someone else who can do that bit. And I think going forwards, like there's like you start. I remember I can't remember who it was, but I remember going to Kickstart once and someone saying that what they really struggled with in the election was the home stuff. So, my house is still a complete mess, and it has been since February, because that's when the campaign started. And finding time out of the election, I wish I was a bit better at. To make sure you're working at 100%.
Yeah,
I'm quite bad at and need to get better at.
So I suppose going forward now, you'll have the Conservative who surprisingly got elected in 2021 will be up next year.
Well,
what happens next?
Well, I may be cursed because Dudley's got a boundary review.
Oh, right.
So we've got all of elections in May.
Very
interesting. We will go back into thirds. It's just because the boundaries have changed. So I may be cursed with a 7-month term.
Yeah, no, I tell you what, we had loads of that as well, because for those listeners that don't know, when you're in thirds, like Preston is, like Dudley is, that when you have an all-out election, it is harsh on the people the year before the all-out election that they only get a single-year term. And then the way it works is when you're elected on all-out election on third, so whoever comes top of the ballot will get 4 years. Whoever comes second will usually get 3, and whoever comes third will only get a single-year term. So I remember there was a councillor in my patch who had just been elected, got a 1-year term, came third on the ballot, and then got another single-year term. So I don't want to scare you, Ryan, but how do you then? Well, but it's an important thing. So that's another really key lesson. So you've won here. You've had a great result. Now I suppose the goal is win all 3 in May.
And I think the size of the majority that we ended up getting gives us a bit of leeway. So the issue for us is going to be getting people to think about the Lib Dem focus team rather than Lib Dem Ryan.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be in all of our messaging going forwards. We need to introduce our candidates as soon as possible, of which they aren't selected yet. So as soon as possible isn't quite possible, anytime soon. But that's the next month or so. We should have those in place.
Yeah, and then it is, and again, it can be awkward if you're changing boundaries for those that are listening, because again, basically after 2018 in Preston, when we knew we had all ups in 2019, obviously you represent your ward if you're elected, but basically we were working on a campaign point of view of the new boundaries. That was it. So our Cllr leaflet, which had called whole new areas, which were rock solid Labour coming into it, bits of a Tory area that was coming into it, we included them right from the off, so they weren't coming up to the election going, oh, we're suddenly in Cllr ward. How does that work? And they had leaflet. Plus, you also got to remind people that they'll have 3 votes, which you need to hammer home more than you'll ever think possible, because even on election day, we were saying, oh yeah, I voted for Cllr because she was top, Claire Craven. I said, oh, did you vote for myself and Debbie? We got 3 votes. And even on every single leaflet from every pie, it said, you've got 3 votes, you vote 3 times. So you can never be too early with your messaging.
Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge, I think. The other side of it, though, is that people who are willing to split their vote, I think more and more people are willing to split their vote. So I am going into it expecting to come out of it a councillor, because there are more and more people who will go, well, I'm a Conservative, so I'll give the Tories 2, and that Ryan who fixed that pothole 1. So I think it gives us some benefits in some ways. The difficult bit is going to be getting the other 2 on the ballot in with me.
Yeah, and I would say, just to all Lib Dems, this is a personal bit of advice for myself, is when you have an all-out election, don't try and be overly clever. Don't try and think, oh, you know what, if we just put one candidate here, one candidate there, you'll end up just being annihilated in all of them. I said, if you've only got limited candidates, that's fine. We didn't quite get a full slate because we'd never had to find 48 candidates before in 2019. I think
72.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we got in the end about 44. So every ward had at least 2. All our target wards and major development wards had all 3. But if you're likely to only win one ward, pack that ward with things, because it's amazing actually how often you talk about vote splitting, the residents tend to stick. It's amazing how often if they voted Lib Dem for Ryan, they might vote Lib Dem for the other 2, and you might get an extra 200 odd votes more than your other Lib Dems, but you might still get them over the line. So that's but it's an exciting time for you anyway. And can I ask, this is obviously you are the 8th young Liberal to be elected in 2023. Now, after Keir Mather's election in Selby and Ainsty, there was a lot of chat in the media and everywhere else about young people being involved in politics. And as Tom Morrison said, Johnny Mercer could give his head a wobble. But also, it's about, we need young people being represented in our community because we are part of that. Well, I don't lump myself in with you. I am now firmly middle-aged. But, we need young people to be engaged because, if you're old enough, then it's whether you're good enough.
Yeah, and I would say actually, John, in local politics, you're still firmly a young person.
Yeah, I am. Thank you. You can come on again.
I think that's part of the problem, though, isn't it? That our politics suits a certain demographic of people. The way local government is set up, the fact that it's a part-time allowance. In some places, the meetings don't happen in the day, which doesn't. I'm lucky in Dudley; they're all evening meetings, but the vast majority of them. But that's not the case everywhere, and so it doesn't suit. It suits retired people with no caring responsibilities, and that is predominantly old men.
Yeah.
And then you look at the people who get elected, and it's no surprise that it's predominantly old men, and so. It's going to be tough. I'm under no impression that it's going to be tough. I've got a full-time job and caring responsibilities and now also a councillor. I know that's going to be tough, but more and more people need to break through and do it so we can change it, I think.
I should just finish off by saying just a massive congratulations, Ryan. Breaking through into an area is really tough, because we often talk, we have lots of people on this podcast who are part of big, strong, dynamic teams, but sometimes it takes someone like yourself just to think, I'm going to win and I'm going to break through. And how many people will now be inspired in your area to think, well, maybe I can do that, and I think you've done a great service by the party. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on it.
No, you're very welcome. So thank you everyone who's listened to the podcast. Obviously, you can follow Ryan on Twitter or X or whatever it's called. It'll probably change by next week. But we really appreciate you listening and watching. If you've got any questions, do fire them our way. It's been such a fascinating discussion because, very often our conversation has been Lib Dems versus Tories. What happens, when you get the run of things? Sometimes you have to win against the grain when things are against you, and Ryan has proven that in spades. So thank you very much for listening and watching. We'll be back with another episode very soon, and we'll catch you again in the next one.